In the circles I travel in, this kind of video is regarded as very unfashionable, very cringe, very early 2000s, but I suspect there's still an audience for it, and I've done my best not to duplicate similarly titled videos that already exist. Plenty of people have covered the age-old arguments for and against God and religion, and of course, I encountered and were influenced by those growing up, but that's not what I'm going to talk about in this video. What information people accept as true or false is less interesting to me than why they make those determinations, which I'd say has much more to do with psychology and personal experience than, say, a rational analysis. So I don't believe in God, obviously, and I think religious teachings are untrue, and that makes me an atheist by definition, but that's not why I'm an atheist. I'm an atheist because particular circumstances allowed me to become an atheist, and then upon further consideration, I didn't change my mind. Okay, so what's my story? Well, it's not complicated. I stopped believing in God when I was about 6 years old. So there are some common explanations for how people become godless that I'm happy to immediately disregard in my own case. I did not stop believing in God so I could continue my sinful life of gay sex and drug dealing, nor was I fed up, with all the suffering in the world that God inexplicably allowed to happen. And I didn't stop believing due to any hardship in my life because I didn't have any. When I was a child, I had both everything I needed and everything I wanted too. Loving mother and father, food, shelter, toys, and no abuse, no dying loved ones, no floods or fires, no broken bones, no prayers for help that went unanswered, just nothing. And according to every adult I interacted with, I was exceptionally polite and well-behaved as a child. I was actually chosen to represent my school, my elementary school, that is, multiple times. I would be picked to greet parents and deliver addresses at school, introduce, class acts and things. And I got excellent grades and not a single behavioral complaint from any adult. And I think we may have found the problem because, if your life is perfect, what do you need to believe in God for? To obtain the moral character you already have, to be given rewards you don't need, to be promised punishments for things you'll never do. There's really only one thing left to be gained at that point, and that's the truth. And if you decide that it's probably not true, then, you have nothing. So this sort of gets to my tentative thesis. From my perspective, based on my experience, whether you're religious or not, comes down to what religion is materially offering you. For some people, religion has a lot to offer, and the rewards it gives you justify an open-mindedness about religious claims and a willingness to seek out more nuanced and convincing arguments for God. But if you're someone like me who sees religion as offering nothing but a set of factual claims, then of course you're going to evaluate the truth of those claims according to the same standard as, any news headline or stranger's comment. You take a quick look, compare to your past experience and other beliefs, you make a decision, and you move on with your life. Initially, I believed in God because my parents told me he existed, and I, assumed they knew what they were talking about, which means, it was not a carefully examined and cultivated belief. So in my mind, God became grouped into a category of magical entities, beings that explained otherwise unexplained observances in my world, namely the Tooth Fairy, the Easter Bunny, and Santa Claus. I became an atheist the same day I learned that Santa Claus wasn't real. I could easily revise history here and claim that I was, an unbiased investigator of the facts. And, I rationally concluded that God didn't exist at the age of 6, after carefully considering all the arguments. But, I'm trying to make a video about the practical realities of religious belief, not about the stories we tell ourselves about how we're smarter and more rational than everyone else. No, that's what happened. I learned that the Easter Bunny wasn't real. I learned that the Tooth Fairy wasn't real. And then I learned that Santa Claus wasn't real. There's a saying, once is an accident, twice is a coincidence, and 3 times is a pattern. I encountered these facts, and I thought to myself, it seems like magic isn't real, and magical creatures don't exist, and even though they can't explain things I see in the world, that doesn't mean that they are the only, and certainly not the most likely, explanation. God fits the pattern of a magical creature, and so, God's probably not real. Again, I was 6, so that's not the exact vocabulary I was using, but that was the spirit of my thinking. So, I just took a second look at God, recalled my past experience, made a decision, moved on with my life. That's the story of me becoming an atheist. Now, the vast majority of children do not lose their religion when they find out that Santa Claus is not real. Kids tend to appreciate that they're being trusted with a secret, accepting it as evidence of their progress towards adulthood, and religious parents explicitly framing it that way probably have less to worry about. But mine is far from a unique story. Dropping God like a hot sack of potatoes within hours of having Santa unmasked is a story I've heard from atheists many times. Santa Claus is just far too similar to God to hope that no child is going to connect the dots. And given that you can go to a mall and see Santa Claus with your own eyes, God immediately appears less evidenced and more implausible in comparison. So that was definitely the immediate impetus for me becoming an atheist. But again, it's not the whole story. Because as I said, if I had any incentive whatsoever to hold on to religion, I may very well have kept believing as most children do. But not only did I have no incentive to be a Christian, I had no disincentive to become an atheist. When I was 6 years old, I didn't even know what an atheist was. I'd never heard the word. I didn't start identifying with that term until years later. So when I stopped believing, I didn't know there was a name for that. And I certainly didn't know that, atheist was a thing that many people wouldn't like you for being. I actually didn't figure that out until my freshman year of high school, when someone in my math group decided to identify themselves as an atheist for some reason, and I casually added, oh, me too. Interesting. Only to find that the girl in our group then went on to conspicuously never speak to me again. And I learned that, maybe keep that being an atheist thing to yourself. Which I did. Definitely in my everyday life, I've always been a closeted atheist. When I worked in an office building, for example, if anyone talked about their church activities, I would just smile and nod. I would pretend to pray at group meals. I'd deliberately sprinkle, biblical sayings into my speech and otherwise give every indication of being, at worst an agnostic and more likely mildly Christian. I've never thought it worth it to start a debate on religion, and there's two very simple reasons why I've never been an activist atheist, or militant atheist as they're sometimes called, who's trying to debate and convert people all the time. First, I quickly realized how hard it is to change people's minds and how fruitless the effort is. And secondly, I concluded that I didn't need to because the decline of religion was ongoing and inevitable. And I concluded that for the reasons that I've already said. A religious worldview is not inherently compelling, even if every word of, say, the Bible were true. None of it matters to a person living without struggle. If I and everyone I love are happy and healthy and I live in a free society with no fear of violence or persecution, why do I care if a God is watching or not? Why do I care what he created or for what purpose? What relevance does it have to my life? I may as well believe in the Greek god or Xenu or the flying spaghetti monster or nothing. The work of accepting the premises of a religion as true is only worth it because of the incentives. The promise of immortality, happiness, and punishment for people who've wronged you. But there's this pesky little thing called scientific progress that undermines those incentives. Life expectancy and quality of life have been trending upwards as crime has been trending downwards, and the idea that humans could create something like a heaven right here on Earth seems ever more plausible. Think about what a basic religious sales pitch sounds like when you remove the incentives. Okay, so everything was made by God, who loves you and has a plan for you, but, he won't tell you his plan. There's an objective morality, nice, but whether you follow it or not makes no difference because no one will ever be punished or rewarded based on adherence to it. Everyone will die, and there's no afterlife. If that was religion, literally not a single human would bother to believe in God or follow any religious prescriptions, and the truth of religion and the prevalence of evidence supporting it wouldn't change that. The incentives are everything, or possibly the disincentives, because even if your life is objectively good and God's incentives aren't doing it for you, a religious community can enforce disincentives itself. The extreme end comes in the form of religious cultures where if you leave your religion, your own family and friends will just, murder you. The watered down version of that is creating communities where members are either not allowed or strongly discouraged from having friends that aren't in the religion, and then leaving the religion means your family and friends within the religion disown you. Though, honestly, it seems more like these external incentives more often just lead to people becoming closeted atheists. As long as you keep pretending to be religious, you can leave your faith without consequence, so how much of a disincentive murder or social murder are depends on how comfortable people are with lying, which usually is pretty comfortable. In my case, although my parents were religious, I never once thought I'd be disowned if I stopped believing in God. But even if I did, I doubt I'd have had any problem with being a closeted atheist and just lying to them. And that speaks a bit to personality, and experience is another important factor in religious belief. But what I want to stress again is what's not important, which is facts. I don't think education or reasoning is important here at all. Interestingly enough, I had cousins on my mom's side of the family who also grew up on the East Coast and were the same age as me. And I learned as an adult, they became atheists as well. Completely independently of me, because I can't remember a single time discussing religion with them when we were all growing up. But what's possibly instructive is that while my parents, for a variety of unimportant reasons, never once took me to church, which you might naively think contributed to my atheism, my cousins went to church every week. and attended Sunday school. And I've heard that a lot of atheist parents hated going to church, so much so that they actually insist on taking their own children to church so that their children may, in their words, have that crap shoved down their throats as well, because they think church attendance is an essential precursor for becoming an atheist. But it really seems to make no difference whatsoever. Religious parents nearly always raise religious children, regardless of how often they take their kids to church. And atheist parents nearly always raise atheist children, regardless of whether or not they choose to take their kids to church. And if being religious was just about being exposed to the facts of religion, that would make no sense. But as I said, the facts of a religion are irrelevant. I was given basic religious instruction by my Roman Catholic mother, and I believed what I was told about God. But since I was a kid, I believed anything anyone told me about anything, which is why, for kids in particular, the rational plausibility or supporting evidence of a particular religion is utterly irrelevant. So clearly, adopting the religion of your parents has nothing to do with objective facts, but what explains why some kids stay sided with their parents while others turn against them. Well, I don't think it's rebelliousness exactly. I definitely loved and respected my parents and nearly always conformed with their wishes. But what I would say is that I don't ever remember viewing adults as having an absolute authority over me. And I think that had a lot to do with me being a very precocious child, because adults regularly gave me more trust, responsibility, and even power compared to other kids my age. I was often treated as if I were much older than I actually was. And so, not surprisingly, I think I saw adults more as peers than superiors. I usually regarded adults as knowing more and having superior abilities, but I knew that they were neither all-powerful nor all-knowing, and that it was possible for me to disagree with an adult and for them to be in the wrong and myself in the right. In the case of my cousins, the older of the two was well known for being smart, but also bossy and stubborn. I hear she had no qualms about challenging her Sunday school teacher with inconvenient questions which she could conjure without end or effort. From the perspective of her younger sibling and the other church kids, I'm sure she was a regular Christopher Hitchens, a natural at expounding atheist-producing rhetoric. So this, I think, is a critical element for losing religion as a child. It's having either a personality or an experience that allows you to view adults as fallible people whose ideas you have every right, and in some cases every reason, to challenge. There's just one other incentive I want to mention as possibly being relevant to religiosity, and that's earthly flourishing, by which I mean it seems that some people are motivated towards greater religiosity due to a belief it will net them greater rewards, not in the afterlife, but in their mortal life. But this is very circumstantial. There's a lot of variance between religions and sects within them concerning how much expectation there is that doing certain things like proselytizing, being charitable, praying, attending services, etc., is going to get you happiness and success in your mortal life. Regardless, there are usually inherent benefits to religious traditions anyway. For example, people are happier when they have a solid social network, which religions facilitate. Periodically reflecting on things in your life that you're thankful for has been shown to increase life satisfaction, and that's represented in many religious traditions like a mealtime grace. So some people, depending on how they practice their faith, may literally find that higher commitment leads to them being happier, and it may lead them to higher status in the religious community, which is a kind of success. But of course, some people just have terrible luck and live a life of endless tragedies and setbacks, even if they're very faithful. Also, many people will attribute their baseline success or moral nature to religious instruction, and I've certainly heard many times from those that became atheists later in life that a disincentive for leaving religion was the belief that they would become a bad person or bad things would start happening in their life. And a popularly cited motivation of religious parents who regularly take their children to religious service is that they think it's essential for instilling a sense of morals. But then you have situations like mine, where I seem to be a specimen of moral behavior from the day I was born. From my first steps, I was a model citizen who immediately received many blessings and accolades, and so obviously that made it quite impossible for me to give religion any credit for my prosperity. And so again, I had no fear when I stopped believing in God that I would turn into a different person or that bad things would start happening to me. All right, so that's it. That's my secular explanation of why I'm an atheist. I believed adults when they told me about God. I knew the popular biblical stories. I joined in prayers with sincerity. I even made the occasional prayer to God myself, not that I ever needed anything, but I saw God as part of a set of mythical figures, 4 to be specific, and when the first 3 were discredited, I felt that that was sufficient reason to discredit the 4th. And even though I knew my parents would disagree with that assessment, I was a smarty pants that didn't mind disagreeing with adults from time to time. I might have given the decision more pause if religion had any practical appeal to me whatsoever. But God never gave me so much as a toy truck, or a chocolate egg, or even a lousy dollar bill. And well into my 20s, I could not describe my life as anything but charmed. I was happy, successful, very lucky, and I never felt like I was missing anything. And so I had no incentive to revisit the God question, except in the context of it being, a cultural and intellectual curiosity, a relic for academic analysis. But to a religious person, I doubt that's a satisfying accounting, because you can easily interpret what I've said so far as, I was mad at my parents for lying to me about Santa, so I got my revenge by abandoning God, who I didn't really believe in anyway, because after all, I didn't go to church and I explicitly labeled all the evidence for God as irrelevant to my being an atheist. Okay, fair enough. But I'm not sure how to helpfully respond to that kind of summary. Certainly, I'm well versed in arguments for and against God and religion. I've read a fair bit of the Bible and the Quran. I've read the New Atheist books. I've read about the history of religion and religious texts. And besides the classic rhetoric, I've actually come up with some of my own arguments against God and religion, which, some people might find convincing. So I could provide a bunch of rational arguments to defend my position as an atheist. I could give you an exact chronology of all the arguments I encountered in the wild growing up and how they didn't make me change my mind about being an atheist. But I'm not going to do that, because that's been done to death and I would find it extremely boring. So instead, I'll stop speaking about things from my perspective or what I actually believe, and offer some hypotheticals that maybe might make more sense from a religious worldview, as best as I can imagine one, being that I'm actually an atheist. So one way I could explain atheism is in the context of evil generally, because explaining evil in the presence of an ostensibly omnipotent and benevolent God is a common project in theology, so much so that it has its own name, the problem of theodicy. And one explanation for why God allows evil to exist is to allow for free will, because true freedom of choice means the freedom to choose incorrectly. If no person ever made the wrong choice and did something immoral, for example, what proof would there be that anyone actually had a choice at all? And what sense would it make for God to morally judge people, rewarding some and punishing others, if people didn't have free will? And what point would there be in establishing the existence of a judgment and punishment if literally not a single person ever chose to do the wrong thing? And so by this logic, atheism is inevitable and necessary to God's plan. A world with no atheists would have to be a world with no free will, and a world where people make no meaningful choices makes no sense, because if no human ever made a wrong choice, the outcome of the human project would be predetermined and God would just create that outcome directly. He wouldn't need us. But free will isn't the only solution for evil. Some Christians actually don't believe that God is truly all-powerful or all-knowing or even all good, merely, very powerful, very knowledgeable, very good. And in that context, it's possible, that maybe I'm not really an atheist. I just say that to encourage people in society to abandon morality, because in a nihilistic society, scientists not bound by ethical concerns can make more rapid technological progress. And perhaps I project that science can engineer solutions for immortality within my lifetime. And since I'll never die, I don't have to worry about going to hell for my blasphemy. And the reason for my blasphemy is because I'm siding with humanity against God. I project that Armageddon won't happen until after scientists have deduced the unified theory of reality, unraveled the true nature of the entity known as God, and built weapons to kill him and his armies, so that humans may be truly free and independent. Or maybe I made a deal with the devil when I was 18, or whatever age God considers you old enough to, sign a contract with the demon. Perhaps the devil appeared to me and told me that I was definitely going to hell for my many sins, but, he was willing to cut me a deal, so in exchange for helping him lead people away from God, perhaps he promised to lower my eternity of torture to, a measly 8 billion years of torture, plus, worldly success and happiness on top. And so either I'm lying about being an atheist, or perhaps the devil wiped my memory of the deal to protect his clandestine influence. Of course, that scenario, I think, makes more sense for militant atheists than for me, though, of course, you have to take my word for it that I'm not a militant atheist and I don't have an agenda to convert people. Other potential explanations start relying on beliefs that apply to only certain denominations. So, if I subscribe to Calvinist predetermination, for example, maybe that might be another incentive to lie about not believing in God, to get one of the limited slots, so to speak. But rather than get overly specific, I think I'll leave it there for right now. See if you can't think of some scenarios yourself, situations where God actually exists and the fact of that is obvious, but for some reason you're still an atheist. How many ways could you explain that? Are you insane? A literal child of Satan after he cucked your dad? God created the world, but, it's a computer simulation and you've seen the source code. The possibilities are endless.